Thank you, Kelly. I'm Sheila Murphy, a consultant in the education practice at Whitkeefer. Whitkeefer is a Chicago-based national search firm which principally serves the higher education and healthcare communities. Today's webinar focuses on things to avoid in your career. Essentially, how not to derail or sabotage or otherwise work against your own goal to have a successful and rewarding career. In this slide, you'll see 8 common mistakes that professionals in higher education can make, sometimes without ever really thinking that they are working against their goals. Of course, there are more, but for today's webinar, we will focus on these 8. Some are strategic, some address issues of basic professional competence, and others have to do with the core issue of professional integrity. Throughout the presentation, we will discuss each, and I hope provide insight, advice, and strategies to avoid career mistakes. The first 2 slides begin with the assumption that you might be currently or at some point in the future searching for your next position. I realize that isn't the case for everyone, but from a search consultant's perspective, it's important to address issues that you may want to think about in advance as you approach your next job search. Evaluating your opportunities without a clear plan or strategy can get your search off to a rocky start and a hard place to recover from. If you are just throwing up a few trial balloons to see where your overtures go, you should signal that to a consultant who is recruiting you. It's fine to submit resumes for that purpose, but what isn't fine is to lead an institution to think that you are a more serious candidate than you really are. My colleagues and I encourage candidates to explore positions, but when it becomes clear that a position is not viable for you to consider, no matter how attractive the offer, it is important that you say so and get out of the search. I always tell candidates in searches I'm involved with, unless you can say right now that no matter how attractive the offer or how good the money is, you will say no to this offer, then you should be in the pool for this position. But as soon as you know that there is no way that you will take the job, no matter what, then you need to step up and be honest and withdraw from consideration. Of course, it is tempting to see how far you can take a search, but it is not good form to stay in a search after you have made a decision that you are not going to accept an offer. But you need to be clear about what you're looking for. This situation particularly comes up in chief academic officer and presidential searches. We often see candidates who are looking at both of those positions at the same time. Aspiring presidents are often betting the odds that it will take several times through a presidential search before one gets an offer. So at the same time, aspiring presidents are often attempting to gain more experience and move up the institutional food chain by serving as provosts or executive vice presidents. They are continuing to explore presidencies. When a search consultant asks you, what are you seeking in your next position? If the honest answer is, I really want a presidency, but I'll take a provost position if that seems like the path that will eventually allow me to achieve my ultimate goal, then say so. It's okay to say what you're really thinking. And while it is exhausting for candidates to be in multiple searches simultaneously, you should remember that the mathematical odds are overwhelmingly against you in any search. You need to cast a reasonably wide net in order to hope to land an important new role. Be sure that you're as well informed as you can be about any position for which you apply. This is hard work. There's a lot of research involved, and it's particularly important if you're in multiple searches. The search materials will often give you a good sense of the institutional issues, the challenges, and the opportunities that you will face. You should read them carefully. Do your own research. Don't ask the committee to answer questions, the answers to which are readily available on the institutional website or in the materials. Don't ask, for example, how many students go to school here. Rather, ask if the enrollment strategy is vetted with the faculty or with board members or with the cabinet. Don't spend the time of the search committee on simple and, in their eyes, superficial questions. And remember, Search consultants want to know talented people, so don't be hesitant to introduce yourself or make your resume known to me and my colleagues. In the next couple of slides, we'll talk about ways you can earn a reputation as a good colleague, a good producer of the work that you do, and a good catch for the next institution you might want to work at. Being a good institutional citizen is perhaps the best thing you can do to ready yourself for your next career move. I know you know this. There are people you want to work with because they do good work. They come through when they say they will. They pitch in when they're needed. They are the go-to people that an organization needs. You want to be one of them. In a search, committees and hiring officers are often hypersensitive to any perceived weakness, sometimes described without much context. You want the narrative that surrounds you to be one of productivity, collegiality, and focused contribution. On the next slide, you'll see that it's important in certain roles to be visible. It isn't fatal if you don't do a lot of these things, but it sure helps if you do. These investments pay back over and over. If you are under consideration for a position where being highly visible on campus is important, a presidential position perhaps, or a senior student affairs officer sometimes are examples, having your references say that you are a highly visible member of the community is a key asset. The same is true for institutional service. You should have a strategy, perhaps through a discussion with a trusted supervisor or your mentor, about the opportunities you have to raise your visibility on campus. Listed here are some of the more visible committees you can be appointed or elected to. If you get yourself into one of these roles, make the most of it. Be there, be prepared, do the work. Take the liaison role seriously if that's in the structure of the position that you are aspiring to. And finally, work to develop a reputation as someone who generously shares the credit. It's easy to be the person who thanks the support staff, be the person who recognizes the behind-the-scenes contributors. And of course, the opposite is true as well. If something goes wrong and it's yours to own, then own it. The next slide talks about the difficult issue of burning bridges or leaving a bad situation. Walking away from a job that hasn't worked out for you and making it known to everyone how unhappy you are is in fact a very unproductive strategy and a major career mistake that you can make sometimes in the heat of the moment, but that can have a very long tail attached to it. No matter how much you feel you've been wronged, tell that only to people who have nothing to do with the institution. I guarantee you, if you speak ill of your institution or your colleagues after you are no longer there, it will get back to them. It happens every day. It always does. And then you no longer can control the narrative. And what gets repeated could be way more damaging than what you might have ever said in the first place. Recognize that if you are part of a reduction in force, it doesn't necessarily mean that the institution is on its last legs. It's not at all productive to make it known to others that you think that your institution is not going to survive a significant reduction in force. Often layoffs or retrenchments are ways to save or sustain an institution. And hard as it might be for any person who is impacted, it is in fact often a smart strategy. Reducing the workforce is a way for an institution to maintain a kind of viability. Another major mistake, particularly in the heat of the moment or a time of crisis, is to talk to the press without your institution asking you to do so. Even if the reporter sticks the microphone in your hand, you may not talk to the press without an institutional okay. Even if the topic is in your area of expertise, even if you really know the subject matter, even if you believe you are the obvious spokesperson for the institution, it is a major mistake to agree to talk to the press without the okay of your press relations, public relations, or external relations colleagues. And finally, when you have had a difficult institutional experience, it is not at all appropriate to engage in blame or second guessing or oversimplified retrospective judgments. There is a significant number of Monday morning quarterbacks in higher ed. You see it on your own campus all the time. The things we should have or would have or could have done but didn't. It's not useful to be a participant in that kind of conversation and discussion, particularly as a high-profile person looking to move up in your career. Despite the great number of institutions and employees of those institutions, higher ed is one big small town, and the number of relationships that exist between and across campuses or systems or parts of the country is really quite extraordinary. So it's just not helpful to be closely associated with a person who engages in blame or second guessing or oversimplified explanations for complex and difficult situations. So take the high road is the summary statement, but recognize the degree to which your reputation as a first-rate colleague has a lot to do with the way that you move on in your career. The next slide moves us into the uncomfortable realm of lapses in judgment and their potential aftermath. We should really discuss this because the professional ranks are filled with people whose work lives have not been perfect. It takes planning and forethought to manage a piece of your past that may not be so attractive to a potential employer. You have to be realistic, however. Not everything can be understood, explained, or will be acceptable to a potential employer. For example, if you're a CFO and you've been involved in the misappropriation of funds, you just may not overcome that. That will be a very hard case to make. Same is true if you're in a direct student services role. If you're the director of the counseling center or you're a officer in a student affairs operation and you're known to become involved in relationships with students, that reputation may not be able to be overcome. But in fact, it is the case that on many issues, people can and do overcome difficult professional circumstances, that particularly when they come from an earlier stage in your career. They also overcome highly visible terminations from their roles for performance reasons. I've noticed that it's especially true these days in the areas of enrollment management, where the press to deliver bottom line results is just relentless. You need to think about this issue. you need to understand that a short stay on a resume is often interpreted as an appointment that didn't work out. And that's usually true. You need to explain it. I hear these explanations every day. More important to me than what happened is the way that you talk about it. Is there an indication that you've fully processed the situation? Do you sound to me like somebody who has used a difficult career opportunity for a moment of growth and reflection and introspection? Do you talk about it in ways that indicate that you really have thought about what happened? Are you pinning the responsibility on an unfocused president, a provost who was a rookie at her or his job and didn't recognize your distinctive strengths as a dean? Do you frame the story when you talk about it in a way that puts some of the responsibility on you? If you absolutely didn't see it coming, can you now explain why? The fact that you lost a job is not so significant. It happens all the time. But what you have done to understand it, to modify your own approach as a result of it, to process it deeply is much more important. So be honest when asked to explain what happened. And then go beyond it. Volunteer some information about what did you learn? What would you do differently the next time? How have you changed? How have you tried to make amends in situations that just did not work out? It's perfectly fine to ask the search consultant to listen to the explanation that you plan to give in an interview. It's perfectly fine to ask for advice on how to discuss it if you choose to raise it in a cover letter. The best you can do with a tough experience in your career is to offer an explanation before you're asked, to never be perceived as trying to hide information, and to take a responsible position on an unfortunate chapter in your career. The next slide talks about the way that you present yourself in your written materials. You should go into a search aware that there is an increasing level of scrutiny on academic credentials and dates of service. So it is worth checking to be sure your information on your CV is correct. Don't inflate your credentials in any way. The impression that it creates is more problematic than the actual inflation itself. Go into the process assuming that every entry on your resume will be subject to some sort of verification process. When small things are not quite lining up, it can open the consultant or the hiring official to think that perhaps bigger things don't line up either. You have to be careful of word choice. If you delivered a few guest lectures in a course taught by one of your colleagues, that does not make you a lecturer in a particular course or discipline. If you're a dean who was asked to step in to cover a medical leave for a couple of months, that does not mean that you have become the provost on your CV. Going out of your way to accurately describe all appointments is your responsibility. And a pattern of inflated credentials can be very damaging and a signal that perhaps other things are not quite the way they appear. If there are gaps on your resume, you should be ready to explain them, what you did and what you learned during that time. If your career has taken you out of higher ed, and particularly if it took you into the for-profit sector for a while, as an independent consultant, as an employee of a higher education support firm, or because you tried something completely different. It's very helpful for you to explain those things. If you have concurrent with your major positions maintained a role as a consultant, as a lawyer in private practice, as a therapist with a practice on the side, it's very important to call attention to those things. And then to explain that how much or how little that side work took away from your principal duties as an institutional leader. Your potential employer wants to believe that you are all in, available, and that they will immediately become the highest priority in your life. And a resume filled with a lot of indications of other kinds of professional interests, typically consulting or a law practice, can distract the attention of the hiring official away from the seriousness and sincere interests that you have in a particular position. So those kinds of outside activities should be listed, but help quantify them. If you've been a part of a private practice law firm for the last 15 years, you can say that you've been, called upon as a special consultant on particular matters of whatever point of law is your specialization. And generally you consult with them, 2 hours a month or 4 cases a year, or something that puts into a context for your employer that this extra work that you do is not substantial enough that it will prove to be any sort of distraction in your principal responsibility with the firm. It's really worth scrubbing your resume on this point, because even when small things don't line up correctly, it casts a shadow over a candidacy in a way that's really unfortunate and sometimes completely innocent and inadvertent in the mistake. And finally, I would encourage you to enjoy the ride. Don't whine, don't complain as part of your candidacy. You have a great role in one of the most distinguished and respected career areas in the world, higher education. If you're miserable in your current circumstances, don't let the search committee know it. When you're telling them how bad it is at your school, they're all thinking, wow, wait till he sees what's going on here if he thinks his situation is complicated or difficult. You want to present yourself always as forward-looking, energetic, ready to take on major challenges, ready to move the new institution to a higher level, ready to contribute as an excellent colleague and a leader in your respective field. So thank you so much for viewing this webcast today. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to participate in the online discussion, which is happening immediately following the webinar, where I'll be responding to questions and feedback regarding the topics of the webcast. So log on to the discuss comment section below and join us in the conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you the best of luck in your next career moves.